It's after 5 o'clock p.m. in Dallas on April 20th, 2001. I'm hoping that today is the end of a false ambition. I think somebody made a very serious miscalculation. At some point in time, it was determined that the appropriate trajectory that I should be put on would be to have me engage with the alleged public healthcare sector as first what they described as a consumer, and then as somebody that would have been an employee in that sector. Originally, my employment was through a third party contractor of labor services for the Department of Public Health, specific to assisting people alleged to have some sort of disability. In the course of this, I was taught a variety of things. I learned laws regarding patient protections. I learned standards associated with preparing for and what was expected in the course of an audit, what was considered to be professionally required in terms of competencies for people providing healthcare, up to and including and especially mental health care, processes regarding requisitions and procurement, things having to do with budgeting, safety involving actual facilities, fleet management in connection with actual vehicles associated with the department, who has access to them, when and how, telecommunications system, as well as database creation and management. And then there were changes to law that occurred, as well as changes to the actual means by which one would code diagnostics associated with treatment. This also included an understanding that in order to prescribe medications, there were certain standards that had to be met, certain certifications that had to be maintained, and validated on a monthly basis. Without those things, you couldn't bill health insurance. And if you did bill health insurance had a requirement to acknowledge receipt of billing and to post payment within a specific period of time. Somebody made a very serious mistake sending me to get that information, including sending me to get that information during a time frame wherein I was supposed to accept I had a disability, and that because of my disability there were certain accommodations and expectations, not only of me, but of other people with whom I worked, based upon the fact that I had a disability. See, if you say you have a political commitment to assisting people who have a disability, with being able to be a part of a society and respected, not only respected, but potentially even able to develop for themselves and move forward in accordance with a certain kind of political capital, based upon an understanding that that entity or society has a commitment politically to assuring accessibility and accountability to and for the role of people with disabilities. This is very important and different matter than if you are not some organization or group of people that is already espoused you have a political commitment to addressing factors in your society around how you accommodate people with disabilities. So if later it should come up that there's a dispute with the designation of disability to begin with, there should be a political course of action. This is part of the full spectrum of accountability. But if you leave and you go to other contexts where people are engaged in allegedly treating people with disabilities and or providing public health care, and you are repeatedly subjected to circumstances where people in the positions of healthcare providers aren't doing anything required to verify that they're a healthcare practitioner, other questions come up. That's where we are today on 420. There was a strategic campaign that was launched during the 90s, but specifically through the early 2000s. A campaign that at certain points was about attempting to address factors related to racial injustice and assure that positions, including employment for people of color and people from communities that had traditionally been disadvantaged, were allowed to get access to resources to support themselves and their communities that would also give them the capacity to express themselves politically, including through ordinary political process, and or also including in being a participant in public structures as opposed to being merely a consumer of public aid. This was a political commitment. It was respected from a variety of sectors. I personally supported it myself. But there were also a number of programs that I now understand, and at the time had my own understanding of them as well, that were aimed at replicating processes that are also part of racism in this country as well around the world. It was known by people in Chicago in the mid 1990s, including people who had been involved in political organizing in Chicago for several decades. Now, during the civil rights movement, Chicago was a very unique place in many regards. There was an understanding that the role of a particular immigrant community and its manner in which it was able to acquire political power had created and functioned through a kind of machine, a system based on an understanding of the geography of the city and a structure by which to assure, based upon this geographic assignment but also geographic access, that people had demonstrated their loyalty. And once they demonstrated their loyalty, well, certain things would be accessible. But part of this was also understanding that certain communities had an expectation of being able to maintain the status quo. And that those things that happened in all those other places, well, they weren't relevant there. And part of the way that happened was by cultivating spectacular individuals within those communities. That would be accorded special access, privileges, including into realms or sectors that otherwise would be precluded against for people from their background or demographic. But that they would be a sort of emissary. They would be allowed into this neighborhood. They would be allowed into this particular milieu with an understanding that there's a transition. You're an exception. And in order for me to grant you this exception, I need for you to take care of business. This was the essence of the Chicago machine. This was understood very blatantly. And one of the biggest problems regarding racial justice is what do you do with the people in your own community whose personal benefit is based upon the subjugation of the rest of the community? This was never successfully dismantled. And I understand now it was grotesquely exploited since the mid-2000s up until this time. It's a hard reality, especially now that we live in the age of genetic engineering. Biological weapons that can target a specific genotype. Electronic warfare that back in codes into our emails, cryptocurrents with particular typecasting of racial and demographic groups that can actually electronically trigger genetic indicators in our own biophysiology. They don't want to tell us about this. Somebody wants to say what? It's a trade secret? Classified for national security? Confidential as part of competitive contract bidding? That's what they're trying to do now. It's not acceptable. And of course, we have a major problem. I hate to say this, but like I said, somebody made the decision to do what they did. And I'm not going to forget. I'm very concerned that a majority of people in this country right now claiming that they are medical practitioners are no such thing. I believe that the medical sector was strategically designed and developed in the last 10 to 15 years as a form of recruitment into acts of subversion. That we actually have a syndicate of bioterrorists masquerading as if they're medical practitioners. And that part of what has happened is they've been using the biomed and the biotechnology sector specifically to recruit people for gangs. And some of these gangs are very high profile gangs. Some of these gangs are connected to long-standing organized crime syndicates that have even been able to infiltrate the federal government and may have been there for a substantial amount of time, either as a organization or as specific individuals that have just held on to the illusion of public office. And in addition to that, they're able to maintain their stranglehold and orchestrate and manipulate policy out of the hands of the people, out of accountability regarding processes that we are politically entitled to, via professional societies, including professional societies that recruit people as soon as they get to college. And that this is proliferated to the point we are at. And that what has been happening in the last 10 years is an effort to intentionally undermine the military based upon exploitation of a past refusal of members of the military in command positions to deal with crimes, high crimes, alleging to masquerade as national security policy or something that could be classified for national security purposes when it had no actual national security utility, but was merely about advantaging select individuals who had already pledged their loyalties to organized crime. There's no justification for engaging in government service, including in the military, in a violation of the Constitution, even if it is to advantage a group, including a group that might have historically been oppressed by that very governmental structure. There's a reason we have the right to alter, reform, or in some cases, as we do in Texas, abolish our government as necessary. But clandestine or covert operations that prey upon people that are actually physically sick and or create people as sick so that they can be disingenuously dispossessed of their political rights and personal property, it's not acceptable under any circumstances. These were the essence of the crimes it took the Western world, specifically the United States, way too long to respond to during World War II. And it's not unique. We still have not dealt adequately with our failure to respond and act as we needed to at that time. We still have not responded adequately to our failure to respond appropriately to what was going on in Indochina during a time frame when there was massive famine in China specifically, starving hundreds of thousands, even millions of people to death. We still have not responded adequately to what was actually going on as part of the political machinations of the 1980s regarding what was later identified as Iran-Contra. And we certainly have come nowhere close to responding adequately to what was actually going on in Iraq following the first invasion of Iraq and how that is responsible for what is still going on in Afghanistan. I contend we have 10 days, and in 10 days we can bring home everybody in the United States military from Afghanistan. If we don't, there are already processes in place that are attempting to opportunistically avail themselves of advantages based upon disingenuous pretenses at serving as part of the public good in political office from the last administration. There are those in the know that know this and are not presenting that in an adequate light. An attempt to delay the timeline, especially around the terms or time frames that have been addressed, is not only disingenuous, but is mercenary. It's not acceptable. We can do it. If we don't do it, then we're going to have to deal with the repercussions, which are going to be severe. And one of those repercussions is an understanding that unfortunately now is a time. This is the last chance I believe we're going to get. If your loyalty is to a warlord, that's going to be called out. If you pledged your loyalty to a gang and then infiltrated the government hoping you'd get your market share, you've got to understand. There are certain parameters that are necessary for the market to be able to function. I would not advocate economic sabotage because the people I come from and the people I am concerned about are perfectly capable of engaging in both a material, literal, as well as political economy. But if we are in a situation where we are being subjected to processes where members of organized crime have specifically and strategically recruited people for their gangs using the medical sector, and by virtue of using electronic warfare and biological weapons triggered by electronic warfare to get us into hospitals and get us into centers where they're microchipping us so that then they can claim our biological materials as property that they can copyright and patent and then say that we are their property and that our lives are to be made available for them to steal to cover up for the fact that they did not cover what they said they were capable of covering economically, then we are in a situation where we are going to need, and we have no other choice, but to disband and dismantle the pre-existing illusion of national gang recruitment. It is not appropriate. We don't have much time, but it is a hard reality, and I have to admit it. I had no intention of being recruited into organized crime when I went into the healthcare sector in the role that I did. I'm grateful for what I learned. It was very helpful. But I also have to let you know, I don't see a distinction between somebody that covertly infiltrates healthcare in order to put forward a political agenda that includes strategically murdering people and anybody that would try to raise some sort of argument against the military-industrial complex. In some ways, it's worse. It's worse to pretend that you're doing something that you're not actually doing. This isn't play acting. This isn't a war game. It's a war crime. It's a war crime. I urge everybody to comport themselves accordingly. I'm hoping this is the last we make at some pretense that somehow subordinating ourselves to a drug economy is the way to go. If not, then we're going to have to adjust accordingly.